Good morning, Querétaro, and welcome to Red News.
Today we're going to explain how the pandemic in 2020 affected the economy. By the end of 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic affected the globe, creating widespread disruption in all aspects of daily life, especially in the economy.
Around 90 million people were infected and nearly 2 million died from this disease, while the global economy was suffering the worst output crisis in decades.
The recovery is still uncertain because of the uneven economic activities that influence the unemployment rate in the GDP in each country, the inflation rate, and many other factors that will be further discussed. First, we're going to discuss about the health crisis between April and December of 2020 and the impact that the factors that shift the demand curve from some goods and services.
What do you have to say about this, Tabata? Let's go with you.
Good morning, Andres and Armando. Around the world, the pandemic caused millions of deaths, and many of them were caused by the high demand of healthcare, like hospital services, oxygen tanks, medication, face masks, vitamins, and many others. As a result, the demand curve for the medical supplies shifted to the right due to the expectations about the future from the buyers, related to the expected lockdowns that were about to happen. These lockdowns around the world affected the economy differently, but in a negative way. As we know, many businesses went bankrupt due to the low demand of their products, like the cinema industry, the restaurants, beauty salons, arcades, theaters, etc. Because of this, the opposite thing happened to the demand curve for different industries. Their demand curve shifted to the left significantly due to the preferences, because people wanted to stay home and not consume outside to avoid getting sick. According to the investigations of Alberto Cavallo and Christian Goodwin from the Harvard Business School, the countries that suffered less impact because of the remarkable decreases in demand of services were New Zealand, Singapore, and Taiwan, due to being one of the ones that succeeded more in containing the virus and were not isolated as the rest of the other countries.
Wow, it's very shocking how a single event can ruin the economic balance of a country, especially when the demand for products and services depend on the consumers completely. I imagine that because of the constant decrease in the demand curve for each country, the supply curves were also affected. Am I right?
That is right. The speed of the vaccine development brought by Britain on December the 2nd of 2020 mitigated the effect of the economic shortage by putting on top the production and supply of different vaccines like Pfizer vaccine, AstraZeneca, Sputnik, and many others. This led to an increase in supply due to the business's products and technology created to improve the productivity effects and growth efficiency, of course. Nevertheless, the poorer countries had to rely on the vaccines from like Russia and China.
So it seemed to be an equilibrium thanks to the vaccines where the supply will meet the demand?
That's right, but it's very important thing to consider that the number of people who appear reluctant to get vaccinated exceed the supply of vaccination. Therefore, the economic now experience a shortage because of the scarcity of this. The quantity demanded exceeded the quantity supplied, which makes the supply curve to be below the equilibrium point.
That's correct, but we are focusing on the supply and demand shifters. What about the massive impact that the global economy had on the unemployment rates, the GDP and the inflation rates for each country caused by this? Let's analyze what a Harvard Business School report has to say.
Chelsea, we now go with you. Could you please explain what are the facts related to the economic and political impact during this pandemic?
Thank you, Andres.
First of all, I would like to mention that the pandemic caused the worst economic recession since the Great Depression, since consumption patterns were affected by social distancing and lockdown mandates. In 2020, the International Monetary Fund informed that the global output was reduced by 4.4, causing the collapse of the GDP by a 20%. The labor market has a severe crisis in many countries, and low-income households, low-skilled workers, Russian minorities, and women were affected. Both reductions in supply and demand lower real GDP. However, China rebounded quickly and was the only large economy that reported GDP growth during 2020. Also, many other countries start recovering by the third quarter, but rebounded by the end of the year since COVID cases began increasing again.
Wow, Chelsea, thanks for the information. It seems that this pandemic really affected the world financially. GDP is a very important metric when measuring how well or how bad economies are performing in different countries.
You're right, Armando. But people should also be informed about what inflation is and how it affects the economy. I personally don't know if my personal household spendings will rise, and I am very concerned. Chelsea, we're now with you again. Could you please explain what are the inflation effects during this recession?
Sure. Regarding inflation, this phenomenon is often described as too many dollars chasing too few goods. In other words, it is when the supply of dollars exceeds the demand for financial transactions. There were a lot of concerns about the rising prices of food because of the initial fears of protectionism and breakdown of global supply chains. In the same way as in the recreation and tourism sectors, nevertheless, to avoid inflation, central banks keep the interest rates low by expanding their asset purchasing program. As the same as the US Federal Reserve, who announced that they will keep the interest rates low until the inflation moderately exceeds 2% for some time. These measures help to keep the banking system to remain stable during 2020. Despite of these implementations, inflation was quickly rebounding. According to Bill Dudley, the vice chairman of Fed's prices might necessarily increase to balance demand with the available supply, which the pandemic diminished.
Very interesting. Now we understand why the economy didn't crash as it happened in other countries apart from the US. I hope that when prices go up, to balance the economy won't be for long.
Well, let's hope for the best, Andres. But talking about positivity, let's hope that the unemployment rate gets better soon. We have reports that are bad news for a lot of people who are part of the working force. Chelsea, you are more informed than us. What happened in this sector? Why? Are we in the worst point of this crisis?
Talking about unemployment, in 2020, unemployment rate had an increase of 6.4%, since many of the businesses were cutting off employees in order to survive. Likewise, the world suffered from a cyclical unemployment because of the SARS-CoV virus. According to a Harvard report, it managed to bankrupt the most extreme quantity of businesses, comparing it with other recessions. The employment demand decreased dramatically, and the unemployment rate increased, generating a big surplus in the labor market, leaving more and more jobless people. The critical point of the crisis lasted for another 4 to 5 months, where things were starting to improve and balance between supply and demand curves.
Wow, now I am concerned about the people affected by this unemployment crisis. But if businesses were closing and inflation wasn't so drastic, what happened to people's consumption if they couldn't leave their homes?
I think I can answer that question. According to the Harvard report, it seems that a lot of the businesses that managed to adapt to the crisis made a lot of business investments so that they could readapt their business models from physical to online models. In that way, firms could continue selling through the internet. And this digitalization was crucial for maintaining the consumption with those conditions.
I see. So people who kept their jobs only changed their way of consumption, but they were still consuming, right?
That is correct, but a little bit inaccurate. The investment made by large companies to digitalize commerce helped the economy to regulate the level of consumption. But if you talk about individuals, many people decrease their consumption because the uncertainty of the future and what could it happen in this pandemic made a lot of people take the decision to save their money instead of de-saving it, their resources, so that they could be backed up in this crisis.
Now, our special analyst Valeria will help us summarize the key takeaways about this global pandemic crisis.
To conclude, looking back a year from now, the pandemic has had the economy with lots of ups and downs, forcing the companies to reinvent themselves so people can still consume even in the lockdown, just as we mentioned before. Unemployment rate, GDP, and inflation are just some of the measures that were affected in this global situation. The amount of people deceased is unfortunate, but consumption diminished, but it is projected to increase and balance in the next years to come. In the positive point of view, by now more countries have been recovering gradually, and every time fewer people require extreme measures. The distribution and development of vaccines also help the economy of different countries to balance their economy.
That's all for today. Hopefully this information has been helpful to you.
Exactly, Armando. Thank you all for listening.
My name is Armando Rambula.
I'm Andres Ramirez, and remember, good news are red news.
Good morning, Querétaro, and welcome to